subject that we're talking about is going to be dependents. In several of the situations or the scenarios that we talked about for the filing status, we said that the person had to be a dependent of the taxpayer, had to qualify as a dependent for the taxpayer. Okay, you're going to need to be able to determine whether a person actually qualifies as a dependent or not by applying the applicable dependency test. Just because a person has a child or someone that lives with them does not mean that that person qualifies as a dependent for them. On the intake and interview sheet that you have, it asks them to list all the people who live with them or the people who they supported that did not live with them. So you're going to be looking at those individuals, and then you would have to go through the test, the dependency test for each one, to see whether they actually qualify as a dependent on the tax return. Okay, this is going to be, let's see, tab C in your 4012, and then in your 4491 you'll find the information in chapter 6. Okay, first of all, we have 3 tests that must be met for all dependents. We have what's called the dependency test, and basically what this means is if your taxpayer can qualify to be claimed as a dependent by someone else, they cannot claim any dependents on their tax return. We have the joint return test, which basically means that normally you cannot claim a person who is married and filing a joint return as a dependent on your tax return. However, if the only reason that potential dependent is filing a joint return is to claim a refund of withheld income taxes or estimated tax paid, then you can pass that test even though they filed jointly. Okay, then the person must be a citizen or a resident. They must be a U.S. citizen, a resident, or a national, or they can be a resident of Canada or Mexico. Okay, additionally, they're going to have the potential dependent is either going to have to be a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. And you have some charts in your 4012 that you're going to start with that have questions and answers that will take you through to see if the person is actually a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. And you want to take them through the test to see if they're a qualifying child first, because if they are a qualifying child, then they cannot be a qualifying relative. But if you find out that the person is not a dependent based on the qualifying child test, then you would go over to the qualifying relative test to see if they qualify over there. Okay, the tests for the qualifying child are relationship, age, residency, support, and the joint return. Okay, so this is a chart that's on page C1 of your 4012, and it kind of breaks it down. Number 1 is the relationship test. The child must be your son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, and there's a slew of others there. We can see that it really doesn't even have to be what we would consider a child, because it goes into brother, sisters, half-brothers, half-sisters, any descendants of them. And we talk about the adopted child who's always treated as your own child, and it also includes a child that was placed with you for legal adoption. Okay. The next test was the age test. So the person or the child in this situation, which is one of the individuals listed in number 1, they must be under the age of 19 at the end of the tax year. It's December 31st of the current year that you're preparing the return for, and younger than you or your spouse if you're filing jointly, or they can be under age 24 at the end of the year if they are a full-time student and younger than you or your spouse and still qualify. Or if they are permanently and totally disabled, it doesn't matter about the age. So we have three different ages there that you would have to look at. Under 19 at the end of the year, or if they are still in school, this would be your college students. Under age 24, normally this would be your college students, let me say it that way. Under the age of 24 and a full-time student, or if they're permanently and totally disabled, then it doesn't matter about the age, they can pass the age test. Okay, thirdly, the child must have lived with you for more than half of the year. Temporary absences does not disqualify you. If you have a child that's away in college or something, then they would, if that's considered a temporary absence, and they could, if your home is still their principal residence when they're not at school, then you could still pass the third test there about living with you for more than half of the year. The fourth test is a support test, and basically what it means is the child must not have provided more than half of his or her own support. Sometimes you have students, even in high school, who do begin to work. And if they use the money for their support, then you do have to make a determination as to whether you're providing more than 50% of their, whether they are providing more than half of their own support. Number 5, the joint return test. The child must not be filing a joint return unless, as we said before, they're only filing it to claim a refund of the income tax that was withheld during the year or some estimated tax payments that they made. Also, we have a number 6 here that is a kind of a unique situation. It says if the child meets the rules to be a qualifying child of more than one person, then you must be the person entitled to claim the child as a qualifying child. And we have a special chart in your 4012 for that particular situation. Okay, also back to number 3 about the child living with you more than half the year. If you have a child that was born or died during the year, then the fact that they were not there for the full year does not matter. You can still meet that test. Okay. However, if it is a stillborn child, then you do not get to claim that child as a dependent. Okay, the next test that we're going to talk about would be they didn't qualify as a qualifying child, so we're going to talk about qualifying relative to see if they qualify there. Okay, and the first bullet, or the first thing we see, is that they must not be a qualifying child. They do have to be a member of your household or related to you. There is a gross income test for this particular one, and again, there is a support test. Okay. Again, this goes back to your chart that you have on page C1 of your publication 4012. But on the right-hand side of that chart is the one for qualifying relative. And again, we have that they cannot be the qualifying child. You would have already started with that, with the test for qualifying child to see if they qualified over there. And if they did not, is when you would come to this side to see if they qualify. Okay, it says a child isn't the qualifying child of another taxpayer if the child's parent or any other person for whom the child is defined as a qualifying child isn't required to file an income tax return, or they file it only to get a refund of that withheld income tax. Okay. Number 2, the person either must be related to you in one of the ways listed under relatives who don't have to live with you, and they refer you to another table, and we will show you a snapshot of that here momentarily. Or they must have lived with you all year. Okay. And your relationship must not violate local law. Now, I'm no expert on what relationships violate local law, but they must have lived with them all year. Okay, number 3, the person's gross income, and this is the potential dependent's income. The person's gross income for the year must be less than $4,300. And by gross income, we mean all the income that the person received. It could be in the form of money or goods or services that isn't exempt from law. Social Security benefits would not count unless we're talking about a person who is married, filing separately, and live with their spouse at any time throughout the year. Or if one half of the Social Security benefits plus their other gross income is more than $25,000, then you would have to consider the Social Security in determining whether they had gross income of less than $4,300. Okay. Number 4, you, being your client, must provide more than half of the person's support for the year. This one is a little different from the support test that we had for the qualifying child. For the qualifying child, the support test said that the potential dependent or child must not have provided over half of their own support. But for the qualifying relative, your client must be able to say that they provided more than half of the total support for the year for this individual that they want to claim as a dependent. Okay, this is an excerpt from the chart 2, step 2 that we referred to in the qualifying relative test, where it says persons that are related to you in this particular chart don't have to live with you all year. Okay, we go to your daughter, your son, your stepchild, your foster child, or descendant of any of them. Again, we go to sisters and brothers, okay, mothers, fathers, ancestors, stepbrothers, sisters, quite a few that don't have to live with you for you to be able to pass that particular test. And then there's also a note there of what you would need to do if you were using one of these people to qualify them as head of household, but they did not live with them. When you go to TaxSlayer, it asks you for the number of months that the person lived with the taxpayer, and there's a note here telling you to choose other reasons from the drop down instead of entering a particular number of months that they live with them. Okay, several times we talked about providing over 50% of the support. Okay, so we have a worksheet in your publication 4012 on page C7. And when we were doing face-to-face preparation for our clients, we kept a supply of these at our sites so that we could give it to them, because most of them don't even know what all to include in determining support. So now I guess if we have a situation, we would have to find a way to supply them this sheet virtually to help them determine if they are providing more than 50% of the support. That top section up there says funds belonging to the person you supported. This is the person that they're wanting to claim as a dependent. So we got to look at what funds they had available. Okay, the next section is expenses for the entire household, because if you have more than one person living in the household, you have to decide the total amount of expenses for the household, and then it gets divided by the number of people in the household to determine how much of it applies to the person that they're wanting to claim as a dependent. Okay. Once we get past the household expenses, then we get into the separate expenses for the person they're wanting to claim. And if you will notice there, it includes quite a bit. Most people, when they think about support, they think about the necessary things such as the clothing, the education, the food and all that, utilities and things, medical. But if you'll notice on number 17, it also talks about travel and recreation. And then on number 18, we have the total of the person's other expenses. So it's pretty much talking about anything that that person may have spent money on for themselves. Okay, the next section is where you're actually comparing what was paid by the person to what your client provided to see did the person provide more than 50% of their support. Okay, then the bottom section is if we were trying to see if they qualified as a relative instead of a child, where your client would have to show that they actually provided more than the potential client, that they provided more than 50% of their support. Okay, the next slide that we have is a continuation that goes into some notes about what we should and should not include when we talk about support in some special situations. Okay, it says following items aren't included in total support, and we're talking about the taxes that the person had to pay. Okay, Social Security and Medicare that they may have paid. If you had a person who was working, those things would be included in their gross income, but those things would not be they would not be included in their support. If their life insurance premiums, funeral expenses, scholarships that they may have received, and then the survivor and dependent educational assistance payments, those things are not to be included in support. Okay, note number 1, TANF and other governmental payments. Under the proposed regulations, if you receive temporary assistance to needy families, which is the pseudonym TANF, payments or other similar payments, and use the payments to support other persons, those payments are considered support you provided for that person, rather than support provided by the government or other third party. Okay, note number 2 relates to Social Security. So if the spouses each receive benefits that are paid by one check made out to both of them, half of the total paid is considered to be for the support of each spouse, unless they can show otherwise. We don't usually run into a problem there. However, we have situations where we have children who are receiving Social Security benefits, and the parent is wanting to claim them as the child as a dependent on their tax return. And so the Social Security does get counted as support provided by the child, unless they are not using that Social Security. So when I have the situation with the children who are receiving Social Security, my question to the client, which is the parent, is the Social Security the child received being saved for future educational expenses or something, or is it being spent? If it is being saved, then it's not going to be counted as support that the child provided. But if they're using the money toward their own support, then it is considered as being provided by the child to determine whether the child is providing over 50% of their own support. Okay, number 3, foster care payments and expenses. Payments you receive for the support of a foster child from a child placement agency are considered support provided by the agency. Similarly, payments you receive for the support of a foster child from a state or county are considered support provided by the state or county. So they are not considered as support provided by the child, nor are they considered support provided by you. Okay. Then we have armed forces, and basically we don't do military. That's out of scope for us, so we don't get too concerned about that. But number 5, tax-exempt income. In figuring a person's total support, we do include the tax-exempt income. This could be savings, or it could even be borrowed funds that are used to help support the person. The portion of the Social Security that is tax-exempt is also included if it's being spent for support. Okay, now we have another poll question. It says, Todd has lived with his girlfriend Eva and their 2 children all year in his home. Eva's gross income is $25,000 and she is required to file a tax return. In this situation, are the children Todd's qualifying relative that would qualify him for head of household. So we'll take a few moments and let you go back and look at your slides or your other research material and make a decision as to whether these children are his qualifying relatives or not. Okay, the answer to that question is no. They are not the qualifying relatives for Todd. Since Eva has her filing requirements and her children do meet the test to be her qualifying children, he cannot claim them as qualifying relatives. So even though they live with him, he is still, for tax purposes, his filing status is going to be single. Okay, the next subject that we're going to cover, several times we talked about it must be a resident or a citizen of Canada or Mexico. So how do you know whether a person is a resident or not? So we have a short subject on resident or non-resident taxpayers. To be a resident, they must either have a green card, which is if they bring that in with them, we accept that and that's it. But most of our clients were actually using the substantial presence test, which simply means that they were physically present in the United States, and there are some times that they have to be present. Instead of me asking them if they were here 31 days of the current year and at least 183 days during the prior 3 years, I basically just asked them how long they've been in the United States, and I don't ever remember anyone who had not been here less than 3 years and pretty much had been here the whole time, except for very short visits back home. So based on that, I do consider them to be a resident for tax purposes. Non-resident is if they were not here in the physically present in the United States for that period of time did not have a green card, and they still have their tax home in a foreign country, and says they have a closer connection to their home country than they do have the United States. And we have people who are here on visas, mostly a lot of our students. We have a lot of foreign students who are here on different types of visas. We have some others, but we have a large population of students. Even though they have been here for quite a while, they would still be considered non-resident for tax purposes if they're here on a visa. And you're going to find this tab L of your 4012, and it's chapter 7 in your publication 4491.